Thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. I sincerely appreciate it. If you'd like to see your name in the credits and gain access to a plethora of other perks, bonuses, and extras, please consider becoming a patron today. Simply click the link in the description below. Thank you. You can't blame Adam and Eve for cancer.
And this is where things like disease and senility and human frailty and all of that come into the picture.
You can't blame human free will for cancer.
And the unity, the harmony was destroyed by the free choice of man.
For it is God who decided what our punishment should be when we were banished to this allegedly fallen world. This is appalling!
If you ever try to bullshit me like that again, I will rip off your arms.
Let's hear what Matt has to say about why bad things happen to good people.
How could God create a world where a 5-year-old, obviously through no fault of his own, dies of leukemia? Or where anyone dies of leukemia, or a world where anyone could die of any kind of horrible, agonizing disease at all? To understand these things, we have to go back to the Christian doctrine of the fall. And it seems like there are a lot of atheists and secular people who just simply don't understand this doctrine and have made no attempt to understand it. And that's a problem, because if you're going to raise these kinds of objections against Christianity, then you have to understand, at least on some level, this doctrine, because it all goes back to this.
Translation: if you disagree with what Matt is about to say in relation to natural evil and how it pertains to the fall, then you simply don't understand the theology.
And it seems like there are a lot of atheists and secular people who just simply don't understand this doctrine.
Or you didn't try hard enough to understand the theology.
And have made no attempt to understand it.
I think it's unfair to poison the well in this way at the outset. Essentially, the implication here, although I'm happy to be corrected, is that any atheist who disagrees with Matt's reading of the fall simply doesn't get it. Could it not just be the case that atheists have produced perceptive criticisms, Matt? I guess we'll find out. You can be the judge.
Now, it's our belief as Christians that God created originally human beings who were in complete harmony with Him, with each other, with themselves, with nature, with the world. They were living in paradise. So when an atheist says, well, if God is loving, why didn't He create a utopia? Why didn't He create a world filled with nothing but love and happiness and kindness and peace and prosperity? Well, the answer is He did create that world. That's exactly the kind of world He created. So there was this harmony. And then man chose to rebel against God.
Did God really create a world of kindness and prosperity? I'm not convinced that that is the case, and I think Christian theology itself debunks Matt's claim here. What am I referring to? Well, if God did in fact create a world of kindness and prosperity, why then did He permit the presence of the serpent who went on to tempt Eve in the garden? This isn't a perfect world. It might be almost perfect, but given the presence of the serpent, perfect it is not. This becomes even more pernicious if one is the kind of theist who subscribes to the notion that God is omniscient, which is to say, all-knowing. This means that God placed Adam and Eve in the garden. He also placed the tree which bears the forbidden fruit in the garden. He also permitted the presence of the serpent who would go on to tempt Eve in the garden. God set up all of these dominoes and forbid Adam and Eve from eating the forbidden fruit in the full knowledge that they would fall victim to the serpent's temptation, which He foresaw but did nothing to prevent. And somehow, Matt still believes that this is our fault, that this is the fault of humanity.
So there was this harmony. And then man chose to rebel against God.
It's hard not to view this as entrapment. If you don't agree with this, consider the following syllogism. 1. Nobody can change the past. 2. God's knowledge of my future actions existed before I did. 3. Therefore, I cannot change what my future actions will be. If you understand that syllogism, it should become clear that our actions have to play out according to what God foresees. Henceforth, free will is an illusion. This is called theological determinism. As soon as you accept that God is omniscient, theological determinism naturally follows. So if indeed my actions cannot change, and I am copper fastened to the actions that God has foreseen, I can't possibly do the contrary. If God foresees Eve eating the forbidden fruit, it was impossible for Eve to do otherwise. So how can Eve be held ultimately responsible? It is God's foreknowledge that ties Eve to that fate. Some Christians will try to get out of jail free on this point by suggesting that God doesn't exist in the past. He doesn't have foreknowledge of our actions. God exists outside of space and time. So my syllogism falls apart. And to that I'll say this. It's trivially easy to amend the syllogism as follows. 1. Nobody can change God's knowledge. 2. God's knowledge includes my future actions. 3. Therefore, I cannot change what my future actions will be. So now, God isn't in the past, he isn't in the future. God can be outside time, inside time, separate from time. You can locate God wherever the hell you want. It still doesn't change the fact that I am incapable of changing God's knowledge. And God's knowledge includes, assuming he's omniscient, a log of every single action I will commit. And given the fact that God cannot be wrong, therefore, it's impossible for me to do the opposite. So again, we return to Adam and Eve. If God's knowledge includes Eve eating the forbidden fruit, it was impossible for Eve to do otherwise. Henceforth, you cannot say that Eve is responsible. So no, I'm not convinced, even on theological grounds, that God made a world of kindness and prosperity. He made a seemingly kind, peaceful, and loving world, but in actuality, the chain of causation for the excommunication of Adam and Eve was already set in place from the word go. The serpent was queued up and ready to rock. The tree was set in place in the full knowledge that Adam and Eve would eat of it. Again, this is entrapment. So Matt is simply categorically wrong here. He's not even correct by Christian theological standards. I don't know how any Christian can hold to the preposterous notion that the Garden of Eden was perfect, kind, and prosperous. It might have been almost those things, but the inclusion of the serpent and the setting up of the dominoes such that Adam and Eve would fail doesn't sound to me like a perfect, prosperous, or kind offering. It is, as I've already pointed out twice at this point, entrapment.
And so it makes sense to say that at the fall, there was this split, this divorce. And the unity, the harmony was destroyed by the free choice of man. There was God, man, nature. God ruled nature through man. Man had dominion over nature. Well, man extricated himself from that process and ended up literally in the wilderness and now at the mercy of nature. And so in some sense, he still has dominion over nature, but also nature has dominion now over him. And this is where things like disease and senility and human frailty and all of that come into the picture.
So now we're starting to get to the point that Matt is making here. Remember, the viewer who wrote to Matt is questioning him as to why terrible things happen to good people. Matt himself brings up the example of child cancer.
Take the most tragic example of all, of course, would be a child who dies of cancer. How could God create a world where a 5-year-old, obviously through no fault of his own, dies of leukemia?
Why does this happen? And we're now starting to get a sense of how Matt explains this. In short, Adam and Eve screwed up in the Garden of Eden.
So man chose to rebel. And there was this break. There was this divorce.
And we were booted out into a fallen world. And that is the reason why we are at the mercy of nature.
And so in some sense, he still has dominion over nature, but also nature has dominion now over him.
That is the reason why we suffer. That is the reason why there's disease and chaos.
And this is where things like disease and senility and human frailty and all of that come into the picture.
But who decided the characteristics of nature? Who decided that nature includes volcanoes, tsunamis, hurricanes, diseases, poisonous flowers, dangerous animals, flesh-eating viruses, tapeworms, cancers, and so forth? Clearly, all of this falls at the foot of God. Matt here is pretending that Adam and Eve are to blame for all of this.
And the unity, the harmony was destroyed by the free choice of man.
But if indeed humanity are going to be booted out of paradise into a fallen world, the question becomes, who decided the characteristics of the fallen world? Who decided the structure? Who assembled it that way? Presumably, in his all-powerful wisdom, God could have decided to boot us out of paradise and into any kind of world of his choosing. The point I'm trying to make here is quite simple. God is the ultimate arbiter of all things in reality, is he not? Again, I'm playing by the Christian playbook here. I'm operating by Christian theological rules. God, according to Christians, is all-powerful. Everything is down to him. The buck stops with God. God could have created any kind of fallen world for us to be banished to. But no, Matt here, in his wisdom, blames Adam and Eve for that child who's dying of cancer, even though God is the one who decided the nature of the world that Adam and Eve were banished to. You can't blame Adam and Eve for cancer.
And this is where things like disease and senility and human frailty and all of that come into the picture.
You can't blame human free will for cancer.
And the unity, the harmony was destroyed by the free choice of man.
For it is God who decided what our punishment should be when we were banished to this allegedly fallen world. This is appalling! Can you imagine sitting down and looking a parent in the eye and telling them that the reason their child is dying of leukemia is because Eve ate an apple a millennia ago? This is a joke. It would serve as parody if Mr. Walsh wasn't being serious. Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here. And if you enjoyed this clip, please consider checking out the full episode right here. Alternatively, and if you're in the mood for something else, why not check out this episode right here? Either way, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. All the best. Bye-bye.